"I'll give you $1 million if you serve me in Arabic," the billionaire said, loud enough to bend the room around him, and for a split second, even the clinking glasses seemed to hesitate midair. The laughter came quickly after, polished, rehearsed, the kind that belonged to people who never had to wonder if they were on the right side of the table. Naomi Carter didn't laugh. She stood still beside the table, a silver tray balanced in one hand, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as if the words had passed through her without leaving a mark. But her eyes had already begun to measure everything. The restaurant sat 30 floors above downtown Chicago, all glass and gold reflections, where the skyline stretched out like a promise only a few could afford to keep. And tonight it wasn't just dinner, it was a negotiation, the kind that moved numbers with more zeros than most people would see in a lifetime. At the center of it all sat Daniel Whitmore, a man who built his reputation on control, on reading people before they even understood themselves, a man who believed every room had an owner, and it was always him. He leaned back in his chair now, fingers loosely wrapped around a glass of 12-year bourbon, watching Naomi the way someone watches a performance they already think they understand. Around him, executives in tailored suits exchanged glances, some amused, some cautious, but none of them spoke, because in rooms like this, silence was currency, and Daniel spent it freely. Naomi moved with quiet precision, setting down a glass, adjusting a plate, every motion deliberate, practiced, invisible in the way only service could be. Yet there was something about her presence that didn't quite disappear, something that lingered just beneath the surface like a note in a song you couldn't forget. She had taken this shift last minute, covering for someone who called in sick, another double in a week already stretched thin, but she never complained, not out loud, because she had learned early that dignity didn't ask for permission, it carried itself, even when no one bothered to notice. This time, almost playful, but the edge was still there, sharp enough to remind everyone who was speaking. "It's easy money. Just a sentence. Arabic. Impress me." A few more chuckles followed, softer now, as if the room itself was waiting to see how far this would go. Naomi placed the bottle of water down gently, the glass catching a reflection of the city lights, and for a moment, she said nothing, her silence stretching just long enough to make the air shift. Somewhere across the table, a man in a dark suit, his accent faint but unmistakable, watched more closely than the others, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still. Naomi noticed. She noticed everything. The way Daniel avoided eye contact with certain guests. The way his tone changed depending on who was listening. The way confidence sometimes sounded a lot like carelessness when it went unchecked. She turned her gaze back to him now, calm, steady, not defiant, not submissive, just present. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, measured, almost too quiet for a room built on power. "Are you sure?" she said, just enough to carry across the table. "You want me to speak Arabic here?" The question didn't land like a challenge. It landed like a warning no one recognized yet. For a heartbeat, Daniel paused, not because he was unsure, but because he wasn't used to being asked to reconsider anything. And then he smiled again, wider this time, confident, dismissive, the kind of smile that had closed deals and ended conversations before they even began. "Absolutely," he said, lifting his glass slightly as if sealing the moment. "Go ahead." And just like that, the room leaned in, not realizing that the balance had already begun to shift. The room did not erupt the way it usually did when someone accepted a challenge like that. It did not cheer. It did not mock. Had learned. Often said more than any words rushed too quickly. Then she placed the tray down beside her, slow and controlled, the soft contact barely making a sound, but somehow louder than the laughter that had come before. Across from her, Daniel Whitmore leaned forward slightly now, curiosity replacing the casual arrogance for just a fraction of a second, though he masked it quickly, lifting his chin as if he were still entirely in control. He had seen hesitation before. He had seen people freeze, stumble, apologize. That was the pattern he expected. What he did not expect was composure. Naomi's hands rested lightly at her sides, steady, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze moving not just to him, but past him, sweeping the table once, briefly, intentionally, as if acknowledging everyone in the room without asking for their permission to exist in it. And then she spoke. The words came out smooth, precise, not rushed, not hesitant, but layered with a fluency that did not belong to someone guessing or memorizing. It belonged to someone who understood. The rhythm of the language carried through the room, unfamiliar to most ears there, but unmistakably real, unmistakably confident. A few people shifted in their seats, their smiles fading into something more uncertain, their eyes flickering between Naomi and Daniel, as if waiting for him to react first, to tell them how to interpret what they were hearing. But Daniel did not react right away. For the first time that evening, he did not have an immediate response. His fingers tightened slightly around his glass, the amber liquid catching the light as it trembled just enough to betray the smallest crack in his composure. Naomi did not stop after one sentence. She continued, her tone calm, almost conversational, her voice steady as she let the words unfold, each one landing with quiet precision, not directed like an attack, but placed carefully, deliberately, like pieces on a board that had already been set long before this moment began. At the far end of the table, the man with the faint accent straightened, his expression changing completely now, no longer passive, no longer observing from a distance. His eyes locked onto Naomi, then shifted slowly toward Daniel, and in that look, something passed between them that did not need translation. The others began to notice. The room was no longer waiting for entertainment. It was trying to catch up to something it had missed. Naomi paused then, just briefly, allowing the final words to settle into the space between them, and when she did, the silence that followed was no longer casual. It was heavy, intentional, a silence that carried meaning. Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not fully form, his confidence trying to reassemble itself in real time. "Well," he said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "that was impressive." But even as he spoke, the man at the end of the table leaned forward, placing his hands flat against the polished surface, his voice calm, but firm as he spoke in English now, clear enough for everyone to understand. "She did not just serve you in Arabic," he said, his gaze steady on Daniel. "She translated you." The words did not land loudly. They did not need to. They spread through the room like a ripple, quiet but undeniable, shifting every expression, every posture, every assumption that had been made just minutes before. Naomi did not look surprised. She did not look proud. She simply stood there, composed, as if this outcome had always been the most natural conclusion. Because to her, it was not about proving she could speak. It was about revealing what had already been said. The words did not echo, but they stayed, suspended in the air with a weight that no one could ignore. And for the first time that night, the balance of the room did not belong to Daniel Whitmore. It shifted quietly, almost invisibly, but everyone felt it, the subtle realignment of attention, of respect, of control. Daniel leaned back slowly, his expression tightening just enough to reveal the calculation behind his eyes, the part of him that had built empires by recovering quickly, by never letting a moment define him unless he chose it to. He gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a clever trick, as if what had just happened could be contained within something simple, something manageable. "Interesting," he said, his voice measured, controlled, but no longer casual. "Been lost." Momentum tilted, and right now, it was no longer leaning in his favor. The man at the far end of the table, the one whose presence had been quiet but steady from the beginning, leaned forward again, his fingers interlacing as he studied Daniel with calm precision. "Context does matter," he said, his voice even, controlled, but firm in a way that carried authority without effort. "That is exactly why what was said matters." The statement did not raise in volume, but it deepened in impact, and a few heads around the table turned fully now, no longer pretending this was just a passing moment. Daniel gave a small, controlled nod, the kind that acknowledged without conceding, his mind clearly working, recalibrating, searching for ground that felt stable again. "It was a private remark," he said, choosing his words carefully, each one placed with intention, as if he could reshape the narrative by refining its edges. Not meant for interpretation outside of its original context. But even as he spoke, the flaw in that argument hung visibly in the air, because the context had never been private, not in a room where deals were made in public, and every word carried weight beyond intention. Naomi paused just briefly beside the table, her presence no longer just functional, but central, whether anyone was ready to admit it or not. She did not interrupt. She did not insert herself into the exchange. She simply remained, grounded, allowing the truth to speak for itself without needing to raise her voice above it. The man across from Daniel exhaled slowly, his expression unchanged, but there was a clarity now, a decision forming behind his eyes. When you speak in a language you assume others do not understand, he said, you reveal more than you think. The words landed with quiet finality, not aggressive, not emotional, but undeniable, and this time, no one looked away. The room had stopped trying to recover its earlier rhythm. It had accepted the shift. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to show the strain beneath the surface, the effort it took to maintain composure when control slipped in ways he could not easily reverse. He glanced briefly at the others, noting their silence, their stillness, the way no one rushed to support him, no one laughed to ease the tension, and that absence spoke louder than any reaction could have. For a man who thrived on influence, on alignment, on the subtle reinforcement of his position, that silence was not neutral, it was a signal. Naomi stepped back half a pace then, not retreating, not withdrawing, but repositioning, as if giving the room space to process what had already been revealed. Her role had not changed, but its meaning had, and everyone felt it, even if they did not say it out loud. Daniel reached for his glass again, but this time, he did not lift it immediately, his hand resting there for a second longer than before, as if he were reconsidering not just his next move, but the entire sequence that had led him here. We are here to discuss business, he said finally, his tone steadier now, more formal, attempting to reset the direction, to pull the conversation back to safer ground. But the room did not fully follow. Because business, in that moment, was no longer just about numbers or contracts. It was about trust, and trust, once questioned, did not return simply because the subject changed. The man at the end of the table leaned back slowly, his decision now clear, his voice calm, but resolute as he spoke again. And business, he said, is built on understanding exactly what someone means when they speak. The statement closed the gap that Daniel had tried to reopen, sealing it with a clarity that could not be negotiated away. Naomi remained where she was, silent, composed, her presence steady, because she understood something the room was only just beginning to recognize. This was never about language. It was about what language revealed. And once revealed, it could not be taken back. The air did not return to normal after that. It shifted into something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that no longer waited for permission to speak, but instead waited for truth to settle. And in that stillness, every movement began to matter more. Daniel finally lifted his glass, but this time the motion felt deliberate, almost calculated, as if he needed something to anchor himself. Something familiar in a room that no longer responded the way it had just minutes before. He took a small sip, then set it down again, slower than before, the faint sound of crystal against wood carrying farther than it should have. Around him, the others did not resume their conversations. No one reached for their phones. No one tried to lighten the moment. Because what had been exposed was not just a comment, it was a pattern, and patterns were harder to dismiss. Naomi moved again, quietly stepping to the side as another server passed behind her. But even that small motion seemed to draw attention, not because of what she did, but because of what she now represented in the room. She was no longer just part of the background. She had become the reference point. Daniel noticed it. Of course he did. He noticed the way eyes followed her. He noticed the way no one interrupted her path. He noticed the way the room had adjusted around her presence without anyone saying a word. That was influence. And influence, especially when it appeared unexpectedly, was something he did not ignore. You said you understand it, he began again, his voice more controlled now, less performative, more direct, as if he were attempting to engage on a different level, one that felt safer, more strategic. Where did you learn? The question sounded simple, almost neutral, but beneath it was something else, an attempt to reframe the interaction, to pull it back into a narrative he could manage, one where curiosity replaced exposure. Naomi paused for a moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, as if deciding how much of herself this room deserved to hear. From listening, she said, her tone steady, her words measured. It was not a long answer, but it was enough, because it carried something the room understood immediately. She had not been taught in a classroom. She had not been introduced through privilege. She had learned by paying attention, by being present in spaces where people assumed she was not. Daniel let out a quiet breath, his expression shifting again, less rigid now, more thoughtful, but still guarded. "That is impressive," he said, though this time the compliment did not carry the same weight as before. It felt smaller, earned, but incomplete. The man across the table tilted his head slightly, studying Daniel with calm precision. "It is not just impressive," he said, his voice even. "It is revealing." The word landed differently than the others had. Revealing. Not about Naomi, but about everything that had led to this moment. A few of the executives exchanged glances, subtle but noticeable, their earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more aware. Because they understood now that this was no longer just about one comment or one exchange. It was about what had been assumed, what had been overlooked, and what it cost when those assumptions were wrong. Naomi adjusted the edge of the table setting nearest her, aligning the silverware with quiet precision, the movement small but deliberate, grounding, as if returning to something steady while the room recalibrated around her. Daniel watched her again, but this time his gaze was different. It was not dismissive. It was not amused. It was searching. He was trying to understand where the gap had formed, where control had slipped, where the narrative he had walked in with had quietly unraveled. And the answer was standing right in front of him. Not louder, not more aggressive, just clearer. "You could have said nothing," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, less certain of its authority, more reflective. It was not an accusation. It was a realization. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, grounded in something that did not need validation. "I did," she replied softly. "For a long time." The words did not echo, but they carried, settling into the space between them with a weight that did not need emphasis. Because everyone in that room understood what she meant. Silence was not always absence. Sometimes it was observation. Sometimes it was patience. And sometimes it was waiting for the right moment to speak, not to be heard, but to be understood. And now that she had spoken, the room could not return to what it had been before. The words stayed with him longer than he expected, not because they were loud, but because they were quiet in a way that left no room to argue. And Daniel Whitmore, a man who had built his reputation on always having the last word, found himself without one. He leaned back slightly, his posture still composed, but the certainty that once filled it had softened, replaced by something more cautious, more aware of the space he was no longer controlling. Around the table, the shift continued, subtle but undeniable, as if everyone present had silently agreed to see the room differently now. The skyline beyond the glass still stretched wide and brilliant, the city lights flickering like 1,000 distant decisions being made, but inside, the focus had narrowed, not on the deal, not on the numbers, but on the moment that had quietly redefined both. Naomi stepped forward again, her role guiding her movements, her hand steady as she refilled a glass that no one had asked to be filled, because professionalism, unlike attention, did not depend on recognition. But even as she moved, there was no returning to invisibility. Not now. Not here. Daniel watched her again, but this time there was no attempt to reduce what he saw into something simple, no effort to categorize her into a role that made him comfortable. He had learned too much in too short a time to pretend otherwise. "You were listening the whole time," he said, his voice lower now, not performative, not directed at the room, but at her, a statement that carried more reflection than accusation. Naomi paused just slightly, her hand resting near the edge of the table, her gaze steady when she met his. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without apology. The honesty did not challenge him. It clarified something he had already begun to understand. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes shifting briefly across the table, taking in the faces of the people whose opinions mattered, whose trust he needed, whose silence now felt heavier than before. He had built deals in rooms like this for years, knew how to recover from missteps, knew how to pivot, to redirect, to reassert control without appearing to fight for it. But this was different. This was not a miscalculation in numbers. This was a miscalculation in judgment. And judgment, once questioned, did not repair itself through strategy alone. The man at the end of the table remained still, his presence steady, his gaze unwavering, waiting not for an explanation, but for something more meaningful, something that could not be rehearsed. Daniel understood that too. He exhaled slowly, setting his glass down once more, this time with intention, as if closing a chapter he had not expected to write. "What I said earlier," he began, the words coming more carefully now, not forced, not defensive, but measured, was not appropriate for this setting. It was not a grand statement. It was not dramatic. But it was different. It was the first time that night he had chosen acknowledgement over control. The room responded in silence again, but this silence was not resistant. It was evaluative, listening, weighing. Naomi did not react outwardly. She did not nod. She did not smile. She simply listened, the same way she always had, with full attention, without interruption, allowing the words to stand on their own. Daniel's gaze shifted back to her, and for a moment, the distance between their positions, between their roles, felt less defined, not erased, but understood in a new way. "You were right to speak," he added, the admission quiet, but clear, carrying more weight than any defense could have. Across the table, the man who had spoken earlier gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as approval, but as recognition, as if acknowledging that the conversation had finally moved into territory that mattered. The tension in the room eased, not completely, but enough to allow something else to enter, something closer to respect, not just for Naomi, but for the moment itself, for the shift that had taken place without force, without demand, simply through clarity and truth. Naomi picked up the tray again, her movements unchanged, her posture steady, but now when she turned slightly to continue her work, the room did not overlook her. It made space for her, and Daniel, watching her step away, understood something that no negotiation had ever taught him, something no amount of power had ever required him to learn until now. Control could command attention, but understanding, real understanding, that was what earned it. And tonight, that difference had been made impossible to ignore. The shift did not reverse itself. It deepened, settling into the room with a quiet authority that no one challenged. And for the first time that evening, the conversation that followed did not orbit around Daniel Whitmore. It moved independently of him, as if the center of gravity had relocated without announcement. A few of the executives leaned closer to one another, voices low, measured, no longer performative, no longer seeking approval, but seeking clarity, because clarity had become the most valuable thing in the room. The man at the end of the table, whose presence had anchored the moment from the beginning, adjusted his seat slightly, his posture relaxed but intentional, and when he spoke again, his tone carried not tension, but direction. "Let us return to the agreement," he said, his words simple, but grounded in a new understanding, one that could not be separated from what had just happened. The documents on the table, once symbols of certainty, now felt different, as if their meaning had been quietly rewritten, not in ink, but in perception. Daniel followed the movement, his eyes shifting to the papers, then back to the man, and there was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that revealed the recalculation happening behind his composed exterior. He nodded once, a controlled gesture, but this time it did not set the tone, it aligned with it. Naomi continued her work at the edge of the room, her steps light, her movements precise, but every now and then, someone glanced toward her, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, as if they understood that the moment they were now navigating had been shaped, not by power, but by awareness. Daniel reached forward, sliding one of the documents slightly closer, his fingers brushing the edge as if confirming its presence, grounding himself in something tangible, something structured, because structure was where he excelled. "We can proceed," he said, his voice steady, though the confidence within it had shifted from assumption to intention. The man across from him studied him for a moment, not rushing, not reacting immediately, allowing the silence to do what it had done all evening, reveal what words alone could not. "We will proceed," he replied, the distinction subtle, but important, with clarity. The words settled between them, not as a condition, but as a standard, and this time, Daniel did not challenge it. Around them, the others leaned in again, but the energy had changed, no longer fueled by spectacle, but by attention, by the awareness that every word carried weight, not just in meaning, but in intention. Naomi passed behind Daniel's chair, her presence close but unobtrusive, and for a brief moment, He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her movement, a small gesture, but one that would not have existed an hour earlier. It was not an apology. It was not even a statement, but it was recognition. And in a room like this, recognition was never accidental. The discussion resumed, numbers mentioned, terms clarified, expectations outlined. But beneath it all, there was a new layer, one that could not be removed, one that shaped how every sentence was spoken and how every sentence was heard. Daniel spoke with more precision now, fewer assumptions, more awareness of the space he occupied and the impact of how he filled it. The man across from him responded with equal clarity, his tone steady, his expectations transparent, no longer negotiating from uncertainty, but from understanding. And as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the deal itself had not changed in structure, but it had changed in foundation. It was no longer built on dominance or performance. It was built on something quieter, something harder to fake, something that had been forced into the open by a moment no one had planned. Naomi returned to the side station, setting the tray down gently, her hands resting for a brief second against the polished surface, her reflection faint in the glass behind it. She did not watch the table now. She did not need to. The shift had already happened. And across the room, as Daniel spoke again, more measured, more deliberate, there was a realization forming, not just in him, but in everyone present. Power could open doors. It could command attention. It could shape outcomes. But without awareness, without respect, it could also expose everything it tried to hide. And tonight, in a room built for control, it had been clarity that decided what came next. The conversation did not drift back into comfort. It sharpened, each word now chosen with an awareness that had not existed before. And as the minutes passed, it became clear that what had shifted was not temporary. It was structural, something deeper than tone, something that would outlast the evening itself. Daniel leaned slightly forward, his posture more engaged now, less performative, his voice measured as he clarified a clause in the agreement. But even as he spoke, there was a restraint in him that had not been there before, a carefulness shaped not by fear, but by recognition. Across from him, the man who had anchored the moment listened without interruption, his expression steady, but the difference now was in how he listened, not as someone being persuaded, but as someone evaluating alignment, not just in numbers, but in character. Around the table, the others followed the exchange closely, no longer passive observers, but active participants in a recalibrated dynamic where attention was earned, not assumed. Naomi remained near the side station, polishing a glass with slow, deliberate movements, her focus outwardly on her task. But the rhythm of the room was no longer something she needed to monitor. It had already adjusted itself, and in that adjustment, her presence had become part of its foundation. A quiet murmur passed between two executives near the middle of the table, a brief exchange, but one that ended with a subtle nod, as if confirming something that had not been said out loud, and that unspoken agreement carried weight. Daniel finished his point, allowing a brief pause, not forcing a response, something he would not have done earlier, and the man across from him took that pause, letting it breathe before speaking. "The numbers are strong," he said, his tone even, acknowledging the obvious, but not concluding there, because that was no longer enough. He glanced briefly toward Naomi, then back to Daniel, not as a distraction, but as a reminder of the context that now framed everything. "But alignment," he continued, "is not measured in numbers alone." The statement did not challenge the deal, but it redefined its conditions, elevating the standard without raising the volume. And this time, Daniel did not attempt to redirect it. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, understanding that the negotiation had moved beyond what he had prepared for, beyond what could be managed through strategy alone. "Then let us be clear," Daniel replied, his voice steady, but grounded in something more deliberate now. "This partnership moves forward with full transparency and mutual respect." The words were simple, but they carried intention, and more importantly, they carried acknowledgement, not just of the deal, but of the moment that had shaped it. The man across the table held his gaze for a second longer, measuring not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. And then, finally, he gave a small nod, the kind that did not signal victory, but agreement. Around the table, shoulders eased, not fully, but enough to allow the conversation to continue without the earlier tension pressing against it. Pens were lifted, pages turned, details revisited, but everything now moved through a different lens, one that filtered not just what was said, but how it was said. Naomi placed the polished glass back into its position, aligning it with the others, her movements consistent, her demeanor unchanged, but the meaning of her presence in the room had evolved into something no one ignored. Daniel glanced in her direction once more, not out of habit, but with intention, as if acknowledging the role she had played without ever stepping into the center of the table. It was not a gesture for others to see. It was for himself, a quiet recognition of a lesson he had not expected to learn in a setting he believed he had mastered. The skyline beyond the glass remained constant, the city alive, decisions being made in offices and boardrooms far below. But in this room, something more subtle had taken place, something that did not make headlines, but changed outcomes all the same. The deal, once a certainty shaped by power, had become an agreement shaped by awareness, and that difference, though invisible on paper, was the only thing that mattered. And as the final details began to fall into place, it was no longer about who controlled the room. It was about who understood it. The final signatures did not come with applause. They came with quiet certainty, the kind that settles into a room when something has been resolved not just on paper, but in understanding. And as the last pen lifted from the final page, there was no need for celebration, because everyone at the table knew that what had just been agreed upon was different from what had been expected when the night began. Daniel sat back in his chair, the document now closed in front of him, his posture composed, but no longer defined by control alone. There was something else there now, something steadier, something earned rather than assumed. Across from him, the man who had held the line from the beginning gave a final nod, not of victory, but of alignment, the kind that marked the end of negotiation and the beginning of something more measured. Around the table, the others began to gather their materials, the soft sounds of folders closing, chairs shifting, conversations resuming in low tones, but the energy remained different, quieter, more grounded, as if the room itself had learned something it would carry forward. Naomi moved toward the table once more, her steps calm, her presence consistent, collecting glasses that had long since gone untouched, her movements as precise as they had been from the start. But now, no one looked past her. A few nodded slightly as she passed, small acknowledgments, brief but genuine, gestures that required no words. Daniel watched her approach, his gaze steady, not searching this time, not analyzing, but recognizing, and when she reached for the glass near his hand, he paused for a moment before letting go, giving her space without hesitation, a small shift, but one that spoke clearly. "Naomi," he said, his voice even, not raised, not performative, just direct, and for the first time that night, he used her name without needing to be told. She looked up briefly, meeting his gaze, her expression unchanged, calm, attentive, allowing the moment to exist without shaping it. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they were not casual. They carried weight, not because they were grand, but because they were deliberate, because they acknowledged something beyond service, something beyond role. Naomi gave a slight nod, not out of obligation, but out of acknowledgement, and then she continued her work, turning away without pause, without lingering, because she did not need the moment to define her. Daniel watched her for a second longer, then exhaled quietly, his attention shifting back to the room, but his perspective no longer the same. The skyline beyond the glass still stretched wide, the city alive with movement, with ambition, with decisions being made in countless other rooms just like this one. But inside, something had shifted that could not be undone. As the group began to stand, handshakes were exchanged, brief conversations sparked, but the tone remained measured, respectful, each interaction carrying a level of awareness that had not been present before. The man across from Daniel extended his hand, and this time, when Daniel took it, there was no rush, no performance, just a steady grip, a mutual understanding that what they had agreed upon extended beyond the document itself. "We move forward," the man said, his voice calm, with clarity. Daniel nodded, holding the handshake for a moment longer than necessary, not out of dominance, but out of recognition, and when they released, the agreement between them felt complete in a way that could not be written. Naomi returned to the side station, placing the last of the glasses into their positions, aligning them with quiet precision, her reflection faint in the polished surface behind her. She did not look back at the table. She did not need to, because the room had already changed, and she had never needed to claim it for that to happen. And as Daniel made his way toward the exit, his steps slower, more deliberate than when he had arrived, there was a thought that stayed with him, not loud, not dramatic, but clear in a way that could not be ignored. Power could command attention. Money could shape outcomes. But respect, real respect, that was something else entirely. It was not given on demand. It was revealed in moments like this, when everything else fell away. And tonight, in a room built on power, it was not the loudest voice that changed the outcome. It was the one that knew when to speak.